We had an amazing, insightful conversation yesterday.
Yes, we did.
And I loved how you defined trauma. And I would love for you to give me, one, the clinical definition of trauma,
Sure.
and then like how you've developed your understanding around trauma.
Yeah, so trauma is essentially when people are faced with circumstances that overwhelm or overcome their capacity to deal with them. So certain stressors could be emotional, could be financial, could be physical, could be, you name it.
Yeah.
But it's when you're faced with a set of circumstances that overcome or overwhelm your capacity to navigate or handle or cope with whatever it is you're faced with, right? And so that's sort of like the blanket clinical definition.
Yeah.
And then for me, the more I understand it, I like to look at it through 4 lenses, right? How trauma affects your brain, how it affects your body, how it affects your beliefs, and then how it affects your behaviors. Because when you understand trauma from those perspectives, you get a very full picture of what is actually happening to a person who has survived trauma. It's also important to note that the word trauma can speak about the event itself that happened, or the effects of that event that the person is experiencing, right? So the word trauma can be used in both ways to talk about the event or the effects of the event. And when you look at the brain, the body, the behaviors, and the beliefs, you really get a full spectrum picture of how this event or circumstance really impacted and influenced and now informs the way this person shows up in the world. Quick neuroscience lesson. I'm not going to go super deep.
I love it. I'm here. I'm looking for it.
So essentially what happens is there's several areas of the brain, right? And each area has different responsibilities. And so we have what people sometimes call like the reptilian brain, right? Which is the lower part of the center of our brain. And that is where we sort of, when we're scanning the area to see sort of where we are and categorizing people and things, that is where we compute, I'll say, our emotions. And so if something comes up, you've heard of fight or flight, right? The fight or flight response. And so there's fight, flight, and freeze is actually the third option in that. And so what happens is we'll scan our environment, we'll look around, and something will happen and we'll have to make a very, very quick, usually subconscious assessment of whether or not this thing or this scenario is dangerous to us, right? And once we determine that it is, we go through the fight, flight, or freeze. But what also happens in the brain is that the portion of the brain that is processing that information, that is triggered. And the front part of your brain, the frontal lobe part of your brain, where we store memories, where we process, where we make rational decisions, that whole process, executive function, is shut down. It is not even working. So that's why people say you can't blame them for their reactions in certain moments and exactly.
instances.
And it's also why a lot of times when you talk to somebody who's lived through trauma, they can't remember a lot of the details. Or you can ask them about the incident several times and they may have several different versions because different parts of the story will be available to them in terms of their surface or their conscious memory at different times, right? And so it's hard because if we're talking from like a legal perspective, somebody has lived through a trauma and every time maybe they're interrogated about it, they may give a different version of the story and it could look like they're lying. Because it's like, well, last time you said this, you said it happened at this time. And it's like, really, those details are so jumbled in my brain because the part of my brain that would have been processing that information coming in wasn't even alert at the time. Like, it was all about that reptilian brain, which is just about survival at that point.
I'm going to ask this question only out of pure curiosity.
Sure.
But does it ever happen that the memories get jumbled by being confronted with it as well? Like, say, for instance, you remember the incident, but now you have to testify in court or you have to retell the event or anything like that. And that event is so traumatic that now incites like kind of like a blurred, like recounts of
Absolutely.
the event.
That's called retraumatization. And this is why, when I'm going back now to like the therapeutic perspective, when a part of treating trauma, one intervention is like storytelling. We call it a trauma narrative, where we allow the person, the survivor, to write their narrative out, which helps them the process of a couple of things. One, externalizing the event, right? Because a lot of times people who live through trauma internalize it and assume some sort of shame or blame for what happened. So it helps to externalize the event so that they don't carry it as part of who they are and therefore part of something that's bad or wrong about them. The other part that it does is it helps them approach the event and desensitize. Because remember, I talked about reliving those feelings and emotions over and over again is exhausting and sometimes can lead to other issues. And so getting control over the narrative by telling it over and over again helps to expose you to those emotions in a controlled environment, because you're doing that in therapy, right? In a controlled environment that allows you to move through the process of the emotions as they come out, but you're also safe and protected, right? But when we're doing that as therapists, we are also very first giving coping mechanisms and self-regulation skills and mindfulness techniques and breathing, and we're completely giving them control to say, hey, if it gets too bad, stop, we can pause. So I'm saying that to say what you're asking is absolutely, if somebody's on the stand and they're having to recount the details of something that happened that was traumatizing for them, it can absolutely be re-traumatizing just to tell the story.
Right.
Absolutely. So again, that front part of your brain, the frontal lobe, is shut down, and you're functioning strictly from that sort of reptilian brain.
Yeah.
And it's all about survival. So what's happening is your heart rate's going up, your blood pressure's going up, your pupils are dilating so you can see better if it's nighttime, whatever.
Right.
And so all those things are physiological responses, hence the reason why trauma lives in your body, because those responses tend to be what are the most prevalent and available in the forefront of your mind when you think back to the moment, mostly because if you're thinking about the event, you're more than likely putting yourself back in the fight or flight mode. And so your body needs to be prepared to fight or run.
Yeah.
And so this is why the traumatic event tends to live in the body, because again, the part of your brain where memories are stored, where you would remember the details, that part is shut down, but your body is fully active and ready to do whatever it has to do to survive. So that's why the trauma tends to live in the body.
Can we go backtrack, because you use the term trauma responses, right?
Yeah.
Like I've recently learned about all the language around trauma and how we can really identify certain things. So you mentioned trauma responses. How else can we kind of like become reactive, kind of like to the trauma that we've experienced? Or something like that?
So remember, I was saying it's the brain, the body, the beliefs and behaviors, right? And so trauma responses are cognitive in your thoughts.
Okay.
Right? So again, it's about like this internal dialogue of like someone's always out to get you, after you, you're ascribing negative intentions to people's behaviors. So it's, if I accidentally step on your foot, it's like you meant to do that, you're trying to do that to me, you become like aggressive. So there's that, and that starts with your thought process, right? Like if someone steps on your foot and you go automatically into the story that they meant to do it because they're out to do you harm, that's a cognitive response to a trauma that you've likely survived that makes you feel like you have to be kind of on guard all the time. Exactly. So, and it shows up in our emotions, where some people can be overly emotional. Other times people can be detached from their emotions, right? And they can go numb. Because as I said, trauma lives in your body. And so for people who, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that, but for people who have lived through trauma, and because it lives in their body, what will happen is they're constantly being triggered by their environment. And that can be overwhelming and exhausting to constantly feel like everything is a trigger, everything is out to get you, everything is a threat. So what happens is they'll learn, it's like a learned behavior to like disassociate from those emotions and to try to shut them down, which is why a lot of times people who have lived through trauma tend to turn towards substance abuse, because it's a way to escape the feeling of constantly feeling like threatened or in danger. So when you're talking about externalizing it, doing that trauma narrative helps, because the way that we layer it is, the first layer is you just talk about the facts. Where were you? What happened? When did it happen? Who was there? Just the facts. And then you layer in, the second time you go through the narrative, you start to layer in your feelings and your thoughts, right? And so by doing it that way, it first kind of creates the scenario where the event is just the event, right? It's just a thing that happened. It's just part of the story. Then you start to layer in your emotions and thoughts, which helps you understand this was my response to the thing that happened. The thing that happened is not a part of me, right? And so when you begin to go through that process, it helps, because now when you're sitting in a safe room with a therapist and you're equipped with all your skills and your breathing and your mindfulness and all of that, you're not necessarily going to be in that same hypervigilant kind of space emotionally and psychologically. And so now you have the capacity to look at the event with much more logic and rationale than you did as it was occurring.
Yeah.
So now you're looking at it and you're telling a story about what happened versus living in it and feeling this is me. And because again, it lives in your body, it's easy to then internalize it as in fact a part of you.
That's so good.
Yeah.
And then the third part?
And then the behaviors, right? And so that or the beliefs we talked about.
Yeah.
And so the beliefs again are tied to this idea that you start to believe the world is a dangerous place, that people are out to get you, that people's intentions are negative or malicious. And then that begins to be sort of how you see the world. And then of course, once you view the world as negative and unsafe and threatening, that becomes hard to form relationships. You go into places and you find that maybe you like always check for where the exit is or, you know, all kinds of, there's things I don't sit with my back to the door, or there's all kinds of like rules that you begin to create around trying to protect yourself from this dangerous, threatening world. And when that's your come from or your perspective every time, that's going to influence every choice you make. Every choice you make. There are some people who have lived through traumas that, you know, touch is a trigger.
Right.
You know, and so you're meeting someone, they're trying to shake your hand or your hug or whatever, and that's a trigger for you. And who knows how you respond, because if that puts you in fight or flight, do you want to fight somebody?
Yeah.
Are you running out of a business conference because someone tried to shake your hand? Like, now you're having inappropriate responses in situations because the beliefs underlying the scenario tend to lean towards negative, even if they're just neutral, right? Like, it's really hard for people who have survived trauma to not look at everything and assess for whether or not it's going to be a bad situation for them.
It's so deep.
I know. And when the more I learn about it, the more I'm just like, and we don't have a clue how many people we're passing by on the street who are living with some form of trauma, and we may take their response to us as some kind of and it's like you know what, agenda. That's not even about you. I have my own set of stuff going on. Like, the more I learn about it, the more I'm just like, this is heavy. And people are walking around with this load constantly.